Okay, here's what I'm doing. I want to paint some of this light in. Like you can see that the light is hitting some of these areas, and I want to enhance that. So I'm going to take a brush and just paint over some of this light to really bring it out and see if we can turn this rather dull, raw photograph. It was taken on a pretty cloudy morning with some light coming through, as you can see, but see if we can kind of paint some light into this and bring it to life. And I may share some thoughts and thinking as I'm going through this here, but to start out with, I'm going to just come down and I'm going to enable lens corrections, and I'm going to remove aberration. Kind of the first steps that I take. From there, I'm going to go click auto. I don't always do that. Sometimes I just like to click auto and just kind of pull out. I might have already done it, actually. Looks like I already did. So that's cool. And then white balance. Sometimes I want a white balance based on something in the photograph that represents white or a light color. We could try that here and see what that would do. No, that's way too much. So I'm just going to Command Z and undo that and just leave the white balance as shot. So now what I want to do, I'm going to go into my masking layer here. And in masking, I'm going to select my brush. And I'm going to do some painting, just like a painter would. I'm going to look at my size of the brush, and it might be a little bit small, so I can increase that with the closed bracket on my keyboard, and I can make it smaller with the open bracket and bigger with the closed bracket, or just use the slider here. The feather, you can see that there's the inner circle and the outer circle. As I increase the feather and decrease the feather, you can see what that's doing. So I'm going to kind of put that feather up just a little bit high, just so it's a little bit of a softer of a look instead of a harsh mask. And flow and density control how much of the mask is actually applied. I'm going to keep that right around here, right around the 80, and then we can adjust that as we need to, and you can notice that difference as you're working through it. But for now, I'm going to leave it right there, and it's going to be okay. Auto mask, you want to leave that box unchecked. What auto mask will do is define the edges and create a mask that doesn't go over certain edges. I don't know if I want to do that. Again, it's just a little bit harsher. So without that auto mask checked, we're gonna just have a little bit of a softer brush. And so now I'm gonna decrease the size a little bit more, and I'm gonna paint over the areas that I want to bring out some of that light. So we can just paint in, just like you would with a paintbrush. I'm gonna go over the top here of these trees. See that there's some light kind of coming, making its way down. So let's just paint these areas. Just paint them in a little bit. Something like that. But we don't want to stop there. Let's look down into the foreground here. Like, look at this area. This would look really cool with some light flowing in on it. And so I'm going to make that brush maybe a little bit smaller, and then just kind of paint this area with a little bit of brush here, and that's going to pull out the light in this area right here. And it looks like it comes down this way, and maybe even over this little area right here. And then it might just kind of hit the edge of this here. Maybe even a little bit down in the foreground like this. So then we just kind of take our time and paint some areas that look like they might need some light in there, or look like they already have some natural light coming in there. We can look back at this hill area too, and you can just kind of see that there's some areas back there that have some lights. And even here in the, actually later, let's do a radial gradient here. And as you can hear some of the bass roll by on the street outside, add to the ambiance a little bit. And as I'm doing this, I'm reminded of a conversation that I had with a friend. And, you know, this is a person, as like all of us, me included, we just struggle sometimes with with the thoughts in our head and just, the intricacies of life and what's going on in life. And, I think it's important to remember that phrase, that quote that says, we become what we think about. And if we spend our days and we're thinking about worry or sadness or fear about what could happen but hasn't happened yet, there's a certain universal truth where the more we think about that stuff, the more it's going to bring into our lives. And so I said that to a friend, and I said, we just become what we think about. And she said, it's easier for you. And I was like, no, it's not. Actually, it's not. But even if we don't change our thoughts, what if we're just aware and we just say, you know what, I'm going to take a minute and be aware of what I'm thinking about and just notice it. And just notice it and just say, is this a positive thing or a negative thing? Is this something that I want to happen in my life or not? And even if you don't change it, just be aware of what you're thinking about. And over time, it will make a difference. Promise. Okay, I think we have these areas of light painted in as I would like. Something, I don't know. Just these little splashes of light. Now, what I want to do is come down to our exposure and maybe just bump up the exposure of those light areas. Something just really, really subtle. Highlights, we can bring them up or bring them down and just kind of see what looks best. Might have bring the highlights down a little bit. The blacks, sometimes it makes sense to bring those down a little bit so we get just a little bit more of a contrast. You can bring the whites up just a titch, like just a tiny, tiny little bit. And it can make a pretty big difference. And temperature, we can bring this warmth up just a tiny, tiny bit, because if this is sunlight coming in, it's gonna just have that little bit of a warmer touch than just the rest of the places in the photograph that are not being hit by that light. So I'm just gonna bring up that warmth just a tiny little bit. And then now that we have that somewhere in the area that we want it, let's go up to our mask again. And then we're gonna hit these little dots here, these little 3 dots to bring up our menu. And we wanna duplicate and invert this mask so that it selects everything that we have not selected already. So we've selected the areas of light. This is gonna select the areas of dark. So let's duplicate and invert that. And watch what happens if we take our exposure and just drop that down a little tiny bit. It's really gonna pull out those areas of light that we've painted in. And I think that's a pretty cool start. We have these little puddles of light that are highlighting the tops of the trees and this little area of grass right here. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to create another mask. This one's going to be a radial gradient. And I want to highlight this area of this little pond here just a little bit. So you can see here that we have a pretty harsh feather here. I'm going to decrease that. By decreasing that circle, we increase our feather because we're increasing the amount of space between the inner circle and the outer circle. So let's increase that a little bit and then make this circle a little more precise to go over this little water here. And subtle changes, but let's bring up the exposure just a little bit. I want to bring up the shadows just a little bit. And something like that. With water and puddles and lakes and that sort of thing, when you're doing a mask over those, sometimes it makes sense to take that clarity and bring that clarity up. A little trick on puddles and reflections that can look really nice. And also temperature. Let's bring the temperature up just a little bit on that, so then we can see just a little more of that reflection in that little pond area, which is pretty nice, I think. So now that we're there, I might go back to our inverted mask again and bring that exposure down just a little bit more, just to make this just stand out just a little bit more. I think that's good. That looks good. And then go back into our global edits here. Some of the finishing touches that I like to do are play with the color grading and the midtones. You can just leave these circles where they are. And just look what it does if you bring the slider down or bring the slider up. Just kind of personal preference and see where you want to be with that. I might go right about here. And then if I go down on the midtones, I'll go up on the highlights. That looks pretty good. Shadows, I'll probably leave them alone. I could pull up the shadows, just kind of give it a little more softer of a look, versus if I increase the shadows, it's going to be a little bit more of a saturated, contrasty look. Again, just depends on what you're looking for. I think, that looks okay. It might be a little contrasty in my opinion, so I might pull those up just a tiny, tiny little bit. And then if you really want to get that soft kind of painterly look, take your clarity and move your clarity down. You can bring it all the way down, and then you get a, like, really looks like a watercolor or a painting. It might be a little much for what I'm thinking. Usually I like to go down to -20 or so. And then texture, like, clarity brings down the clarity of the bigger details, and then texture kind of brings back the texture of the smaller details. And it's very subtle, but it's a nice. Sometimes if you go if you do like a -20 or -19 clarity, bring up the texture about half of that value, so about 9, 10, somewhere in there. And then your dehaze, you can add some negative dehaze to kind of add a little bit of like a hazy type look. See what happens when you start to bring that down, versus if you bring it up, it's going to remove haze, and again, that's a super contrasty kind of saturated look, and I don't love that in this case. So I'm going to just maybe go down to about a -10 on the dehaze. I think it looks pretty nice. And then final touch is some vignetting, which just really pulls out some of those highlights in our photograph. And I think it looks pretty cool. So just with masking and some global edits, we can kind of like turn that off and see we started somewhere around here and finished somewhere around here. Kind of a cool look, just paint in your own light and turn a photograph into something that resembles a painting or some art, and just kind of fun to play around with that and see what you can do with light in a photograph. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've had some fun here and experiment with your own photos and see what you can make happen. It's always fun to get in there. And remember, there's no rules. You can do whatever you want, whatever you feel looks good. Just have some fun with it and paint and process to your heart's delight, and just create stuff that makes your own soul happy. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll subscribe to the channel for more, and we are going to see you again next time. Thank you for being here.